Cradling her twin children, she whispered a final lullaby before die. The lullaby of star snow fell like a slow burial, each flake another nail in a coffin carved from white silence. The alien woman stumbled beneath the weight of her twin children, wrapped inside her thin, tattered cloak. Each breath dragged ice into her lungs and scraped across her chest like blades. Their world had ended days ago. Fire from the sky, betrayal in orbit, the evacuation shuttles gone before she could scream her name loud enough for them to remember she existed. Her boots cracked through the crusted snow, knees buckling with every step, but still she moved, driven by something far older than fear, far colder than the wind that clawed at her skin. She had once been a singer of sacred things, her voice known in the high courts of Velria, her name whispered as a symbol of light. But titles didn't warm children in a blizzard. Now there was no court, no royal lineage, no promise of rescue. There was only a mother, bones aching and lips split from frost clutching the fragile bodies of her twin daughters who no longer had the strength to cry. They had walked for 2 days since the wreckage vanished behind the white horizon. She hadn't eaten, she hadn't slept. Her muscles moved only by instinct, her mind chasing hallucinations of heat, of firelight, of the father they had lost in orbit when the command ship was shattered like glass above the stratosphere. Her daughters, Sarah and Leon, had been born during peace. They did not understand what war had taken from them, but they could feel what it had left: cold, hunger, and silence. The wind grew worse. The storm roared like a beast made of memories. Visibility shrank to nothing, and her last attempt to build a fire had failed when her fingers could no longer hold the igniter. She held her daughters to her chest and fell to her knees behind a jagged piece of black rock jutting from the snow, useless for warmth, but better than nothing against the wind. She didn't cry. There were no tears left to freeze. "I can't take you home," she whispered, voice trembling as she pressed her cheek to theirs. "But I'll stay with you. I'll hold you until the stars take us together." Her body shook not from the cold anymore, but from something deeper. Grief wrapped in surrender. And then she sang. It was not loud and it was not perfect. Her voice cracked and vanished into the storm. But it was beautiful in its brokenness. It was the lullaby she'd sung when they were born, when their skin was still soft and warm, when they were surrounded by light and promise. It had no words, only sound notes that wove through the storm like fading threads of hope. The twins stopped shivering. Their breathing slowed, steady against her heartbeat. She closed her eyes, holding them close beneath the last warmth she could offer, and whispered, "Sleep, my stars, sleep." And then the snow swallowed everything. Sergeant Darren Miles had never trusted easy answers or clean victories. War had taught him that survival wasn't noble, and kindness wasn't protocol. It was a rebellion, one heartbeat at a time. He hadn't meant to be this far from his unit, but something about the last transmission from the downed ship didn't sit right. An alien vessel, not fully hostile, crashing in an uncharted zone with signs of life still faintly pulsing through the static. Command didn't care, but Darren had lost enough comrades to know that sometimes the dead just needed one more voice to call them back. The storm pressed against his reinforced exosuit like a wall of knives. Temperatures had dropped below critical, but the biosensors pinged again, soft, rhythmic blips too small and too clustered to be machinery. He adjusted course, boots sinking deep with each step, breath loud in his helmet as the cold gnawed at the seams. The signal was near, almost buried beneath layers of white and ice, but still alive. And then he saw them, a mound of snow, a glimpse of tattered fabric, a black shard of stone sheltering a huddled figure. He ran, half sliding through the drift, and dropped to his knees. The woman's skin was blue-tinged, her breathing slow but present. Her arms were wrapped tightly around two smaller forms. His fingers, shaking despite the thermal regulators, brushed the tiniest neck and felt a flutter, a heartbeat. "God," he breathed, as if the word had been frozen in his chest. "They're alive." Training kicked in. He yanked free the emergency heating pack from his gear, broke the capsule, and stuffed it inside the woman's cloak. The warmth spread instantly, not much, but enough to hold them above the edge. He wrapped the tri-thermal blanket around them all, secured the edges, lifted them in his arms with a grunt, and began the long, brutal walk back to base. Every step was a war against the wind. Every step was a whisper that life, even alien life, was worth saving. And in the silence between howls, he heard something faint, notes on the wind, fragile and haunting. A lullaby. He didn't know it, couldn't understand the language, but it stayed with him all the way back through the ice. Warmth found her slowly, first as pain, then as breath. It was not the cold sting of snow or the dull ache of dying, but a deep, radiating heat that pulls through her skin like a forgotten sun. She stirred, disoriented and dry-mouthed, her body aching in places she didn't remember having, her mind still fogged by the shadow of that final lullaby. When she opened her eyes, she was not under the sky, nor in the snow, but in a chamber of smooth metallic walls lit by soft white light and strange human symbols blinking across translucent glass panels. She tried to sit up, and the pain returned like a hammer to her chest. A gentle pressure pushed her shoulder back to the mattress, and a voice not cold, not sharp, but grounding spoke beside her. "You're safe. Don't move yet." It was the human, the one from the ice. He stood beside her, unarmored now, dressed in gray fatigues. His eyes were tired and bloodshot, but watching her as if she were the only thing in the galaxy worth looking at. She blinked slowly, the image swimming in her vision, unsure whether she was dreaming or dead. "My children," she croaked, the words slurred and dry. "They're alive," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "Both of them. They're in the next room, stable, sleeping." And then her world split. She turned her head away and wept, not with noise, not with drama, but with the quiet, shaking sobs of someone who had held death too long and now couldn't let go of life. The human didn't interrupt. He simply stayed close, sitting beside the bed without touching her, without speaking, as if understanding the sanctity of silence in the presence of grief turning into hope. Later she would be able to sit, and later, he would bring the girls to her, both awake, both pale, but smiling, clinging to her like roots finding earth again. But in that moment, she whispered something in her own language, a word humans would never fully translate. Not thank you, not mercy, but a word that meant you return the stars to me. The human outpost was small, barely more than a medical bay and a command tent, but to her it was a palace. The walls didn't groan with ice, the roof didn't weep snow into her hair, and the lights were steady, like the moons that used to shine on her people's lakes before the war stole them. Sarah and Leon had color in their cheeks now, and though they still clung to her with dream-haunted hands, their laughter began to return in small bursts, like embers finding air. She would sit with them, wrapped in thermal blankets, feeding them broth that steamed from ceramic cups while they watched the human soldier from across the room like he was some strange, unshakable mountain. She hadn't asked his name yet, not because she didn't care, but because in her heart she feared giving a name to someone who might vanish. But he hadn't vanished. Every day he brought her news, rations, updates on patrols, bits of tech salvaged from her wrecked vessel that he tried to repair with his clumsy but determined hands. And every night, when the lights dimmed and the wind still howled outside the reinforced walls, she found herself sitting across from him in quiet conversation. He learned her language slowly, and she his even faster. They traded words like seeds, planting meanings into each other's minds with patience and curiosity. He was not what she had been taught a human soldier would be. He did not boast. He did not command. He simply was present, watchful, kind in the quiet way of men who've seen too much death to speak of it anymore. One night, while her daughters slept and the wind outside screamed against the reinforced steel like a ghost denied entry, he lit a small flame on a portable stove. "I don't like the cold," he muttered. "Never did." She watched him across the flickering light, shadows dancing on the walls behind him, and said nothing for a long time. "I sang their death song," she said at last, voice low, trembling with something that was no longer just sorrow. "I know," he replied softly. "I was ready to let go. I wanted to die with them, and you pulled me back." He looked into the flame, jaw clenched, then met her eyes. "You were singing them to sleep," he said. "I wasn't going to let that be the last thing they heard." The silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred. She reached across the table, placed her hand lightly over his, and this time he didn't flinch. They stayed like that until the flame burned down to survivors, neither of them whole, but both still warm, alive, together under human light. Darren didn't tell anyone back at Central about her. Protocol demanded he report any non-combatant alien survivors to the Terran Alliance for processing and review. But he'd seen what processing meant during the siege of Caro's. Families separated, names erased, memories rewritten for diplomatic neatness. He wasn't going to let that happen to her. Not after the storm. Not after watching her body curled around her daughters like she had become their last shield against death. He repaired what little he could from her ship, fragments of the nav core, a cracked cum relay, some emergency rations that had survived the impact, but nothing in the wreckage gave him a name, a file, or a flag. She had no insignia, no rank, no record. To Earth Command, she didn't exist. And for a time, that was perfect. She moved with silent precision around the outpost, now no longer a ghost, no longer frozen. She cooked in the mess tent without asking. She adjusted Darren's broken translator mid-sentence. She even repaired the synthetics insulation after watching one short out during a cold snap, her fingers faster than any mechanic he'd ever seen. The other soldiers noticed her, of course. They watched from a distance, curiosity blooming slow and awkward like frost thaw. None dared approach her daughters, but she did not hide anymore. She walked the halls with her chin up, with her hands resting gently on the heads of her twin girls who now ran in circles through the camp like spirits reborn. The human base wasn't made for children, but Darren didn't stop them. The laughter was good. It reminded them they hadn't died out there, and it made the men softer without them realizing it. One night she found Darren outside, alone at the edge of the ridge, watching the stars flicker through the frost-hazed sky. "You still don't sleep much," she said in her language. "Never did," he replied without turning. She stepped beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off his body, close enough to remember how human men didn't hide when they wept. I remember who I was," she said quietly. "Before the war, before the crash." He looked at her just once before returning his gaze to the stars. "You don't have to tell me, but I want to." She told him her name, Erlvain, though she hadn't spoken it aloud in what felt like years. She told him she was a planetary advisor's daughter, trained in atmospheric engineering and ancient cultural preservation. She had not been a soldier, but she had been on the diplomatic ship that was destroyed in orbit. Her husband had died in that fire. "They called us collateral," she said. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and didn't say sorry. She didn't want sorry. He just nodded. She exhaled and leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, and they stood like that until the frost kissed their eyelashes and the world around them went quiet again. The call came down from command 2 weeks later. A retrieval unit had intercepted thermal anomalies from a region not far from Sector 9, flagged as possible unauthorized activity. Darren's unit was ordered to confirm, report, and if necessary, neutralize. He knew what that meant. It meant Central had caught the heat signature from the twins. It meant his silence had expired. He stood in the hangar with the message blinking on his datapad, cold sweat forming under the collar of his thermal armor. He could lie one more time, or he could run. He found her in the supply room, sorting salvage tools while the girls played with a crate of thermal beads nearby. She looked up when she saw him, saw his expression, and her face stilled like a pond before a stone strikes. "They're coming," he said. "Not for war, not yet, but they're looking for anomalies." She didn't panic. Her eyes closed for a moment, her breath steadying. She nodded. "I won't let them take you," he said, voice firmer now, like stone beneath water. "You can't fight all of them. I don't need to. I just need to get you far enough." She looked over at her daughter Sarah, now tying a bead to her sister's braid. With serious concentration. "They'll never be safe. They will if they're with me," he said. "I've survived worse than this. I can disappear with them. With you. If that's what you want." She studied him for a long time, this scarred human with his broken smile and his silence that had made space for her pain. Then she walked over, touched his cheek, and nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Take us home." That night, while the others slept, Darren powered up the old scout skimmer buried in the snowbank behind the cargo depot. It sputtered, it groaned, but it held. She carried her daughters inside, wrapping them in the same cloak she'd nearly died in, now lined with the blankets of a Terran outpost and stitched with stolen warmth. He took the controls, glanced at her once. "Ready?" She leaned in close, pressed her forehead to his, and said, "Wherever you go, that's the home we choose." And then they left behind frost, fire, and the silence that no longer owned them. They did not travel through map space. Darren had hacked into an old supply vessel's navigation logs, pre-war routes, long abandoned, unsafe for commerce but safe for ghosts. The skimmer, patched together with hope and spare parts, rattled like a dying heart through the blackness, its stealth field flickering only when they passed too close to radiation belts. Errol sat with her daughters in the rear cabin, wrapped in layers of warmth, while Darren remained at the helm, fingers tense on the controls, eyes tracing each pulse of the nav beacon like a man steering through a minefield of memories. They stopped only when they had to asteroid tunnels, moon craters, empty gas stations orbiting dead worlds. Darren scavenged fuel in silence. Errol helped him disassemble unused tech for battery cores, converting alien signatures into human-friendly signals with an expertise that startled even him. She didn't speak often during those days, but when she did, it was never about fear, only about survival. The twins had begun to sleep better. That was the first sign things were changing. Sarah smiled more now, often resting against Errol's side as if her mother's heartbeat had become more familiar than her own. Leanne no longer jolted awake from phantom echoes. Instead, she would stare at the stars from the ship's rear viewport and ask quiet questions about constellations, about whether the sky in her old world was still watching. On one cold stretch between black holes, the skimmer passed through a storm belt, electromagnetic waves flickering like firelight across the hull. The gravity distortion pulled the ship sideways, and for one terrifying moment they tumbled. Darren shouted, pulling on the thrusters while Errol held her daughters against the crash wall. But the ship leveled. The light passed. After the silence returned, Errol stepped forward to where Darren sat slumped in the chair, his breath ragged from the tension. "You didn't panic," she said. "I couldn't," he whispered. "You were watching." She placed her hand on his shoulder, warm, certain. "And now I know we'll make it." He didn't reply, not with words, but his hand reached up to rest on hers, fingers curling as if to say, "I'll never stop flying." The next world they reached wasn't named on any Terran registry, and the beacon was dark, but it had trees and water and air that didn't taste like fire. The landing was rough but soft enough to keep the hull intact. The forest greeted them in silence, giant white bark trees swaying in slow rhythm, leaves humming with bioluminescence, roots spreading across black soil that drank in starlight. Errol stepped down first, her boots sinking gently into the earth, and for a moment her breath caught. The smell reminded her of her childhood planet before the Civil War, wet air, singing insects, the pulse of a world not yet ruined by fire. Darren brought out the portable shelter and dug the first post by hand. The base took shape in today's, not a palace, not a fortress, but a home. A single dome-shaped structure made from harvested alloy and grafted alien polymer, sealed from storm winds and heated by the same core that had once kept the skimmer alive. The twins helped, too, Leanne hauling small branches, Sarah painting soft constellations inside the walls with colored minerals found near the riverbed. At night, Errol and Darren would sit by the edge of the stream, listening to the sound of water and wind folding into one another. They didn't speak about what had been left behind, not the war, not the orders, not the world that would one day wonder where Sergeant Darren Miles had disappeared to after going rogue. Instead, they spoke of now. "How long do you think we'll last here?" she asked one evening, her voice low, hands resting on her knees. He shrugged, glancing at the sky. "Long enough to matter." She nodded, and then she said something that made his chest tighten. "More than a wound ever had. I never imagined it would be a human who gave my daughters a childhood." He didn't know what to say, so he placed a hand over hers and said the only thing that mattered. "I never imagined it would be an alien who gave me a reason to live." That night she kissed him. It was not rushed. It was not dramatic. It was a quiet thing, two souls who had survived frost, fire, exile, and silence finding warmth not in the body but in the trust of shared breath, and in the distance beneath alien stars, the twins dreamed without fear. The forest hummed its soft lullaby, the kind only heard by those who had chosen to stop running. And for the first time in years, no one was preparing to die. The seasons on the unnamed world were strange, long days that bled into each other and nights lit by moons that shimmered like silver bones. In time, Darren built a water filter out of scavenged tech while Errol learned how to coax the tall breathing trees into sheltering them with living shade. The girls grew faster than expected, resilient, quick-witted, and clever with their hands. Sarah learned how to craft flutes from reed bones, while Leanne had taken to mapping the stars, insisting she could find her mother's lost world by tracing patterns in the sky. It should have been peaceful, and mostly it was. But peace, Errol had learned, was never eternal in a galaxy that feared silence more than it feared war. The transmission came at dusk, slicing through the shielded relay Darren had buried months ago like a knife through old bark. It wasn't addressed to him directly, but he knew the signature: Terran Naval Recon, encrypted with his old clearance code, piggybacking on Lost World scans. They had found a ghost, and now they wanted to see if it bled. Arl watched him from across the clearing as he stood frozen, datapad in hand, shoulders tight as stone. When she approached, he didn't hide the screen. He never had. "They're coming," he said simply. "Not with guns. With questions," she said. "They'll want to know why a human soldier vanished with a mother and her daughters who technically never existed," she said. "They'll bring drones, maybe scouts, and then policies." He nodded, but when she looked at him again, it wasn't fear she saw on his face. It was a kind of calm defiance, the kind that only came from a man who had already made his decision 100 days ago. "Then let them come," he said. Together they prepared, not with weapons, not with walls, but with truth. Errol braided her daughter's hair that night with ribbons of polished shell, and told them the full story of the ice storm, the lullaby, and the man who had carried them through fire. Darren, meanwhile, recorded a transmission, one that would greet the recon team when they arrived. It said, "This world isn't lost. It was never yours. What you'll find here isn't a breach of duty. It's a resurrection." The ship arrived 3 weeks later, sleek and gray, hovering silently over the treetops like a question too polite to speak itself aloud. No soldiers disembarked. Only a drone descended, scanning, watching, recording the clearing where Errol, Darren, and the girls waited, unhidden, unarmed, unafraid. Darren didn't salute. He stood with one hand resting on Sarah's shoulder and the other in Errol's, a silent message that said, "Whatever judgment you bring, I've already chosen my allegiance." The drone floated there once, then clicked, a sound too mechanical to be approval, too quiet to be threat. It turned and rose, vanishing into the clouds like a messenger that had nothing left to say. They didn't hear from Earth again. And in the weeks that followed, the forest bloomed brighter. A strange tree with pale purple fruit began growing near the shelter one Earl swore didn't exist before the girls started singing to the soil. Darren finished carving a sundial from crystal stone, marking each passing day with notches, though he no longer counted the years since the war. He counted the stories, the shared meals, the nights. Errol fell asleep against his chest and whispered, "You were the end of my sorrow." One morning, Leanne discovered a nest of glass-feathered birds in the high branches and shouted in joy. Sarah joined her, laughing, their voices echoing like bells in a temple that no god had built. Darren watched them and felt something pull loose in his chest, something he hadn't known he still held on to. "You gave them more than life," Earl whispered beside him. "You gave them the right to dream." He turned to her, his smile slow, quiet. "I didn't do it alone." And as they stood there, 2 survivors turned soulbound exiles, watching 2 daughters chase a dawn that had once felt impossible. The stars above them blinked in silence. Older than war, wiser than pride, and kind enough now to remember the names of those who once chose love over orders. They did not need a flag. They had each other, and that was the new empire built not from conquest, but from the breath of one lullaby that had once meant goodbye, now turned to a song of beginning.